December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The supreme need of our time is for men to learn to live together in peace.
For our own country, it has been a time of recurring trial. We have grown in power and in responsibility.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Good common sense and sound judgment of the American people.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
One union stands out. That union is the United States of America.
It is a crisis of confidence that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will.
Democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom, and no one will keep that light from shining.
That all men are created equal, that we, the people, can form a more perfect union.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
It's a point of patriotic pride so we can pull our country out of this god-awful spiral.
Hello and welcome to the Presidents and Prime Ministers podcast with me, Ian Dale. This podcast series accompanies my two books, The Presidents and the Prime Ministers, and each week you'll hear about a different American president or British Prime Minister. And who knows in the future, presidents and prime ministers from other countries too. Today we're going to talk to biographer and historian David Torrance about the life and presidency of William McKinley, who served as president just for one term from 1897 to 2001. David, welcome. McKinley I always think of as a president that is one of the less well-known ones. Now, OK, he only served one term, but is that a fair assumption that in America he's probably in the bottom 10 of least known presidents?
Yeah, although I think that's beginning to shift. He actually did one term and a little bit of a second.
Yes,
and
very
there's
little bit.
An obvious reason for that, which I'm sure we'll get onto. I think certainly until a decade ago, he was ranked pretty low. There's lots of schools, high schools in the United States named after McKinley. But when asked, your average American probably knows very little about him, unlike his successor, actually, Theodore Roosevelt, much better known. I think there has been a shift. So biographers have got to work, and certainly a couple of recent books have argued that he deserves to be much higher up the rankings and is actually a very significant president and arguably the first modern president of the United States.
Now, you developed an interest in him because you've actually been to visit, I think, virtually all of the presidential libraries, which makes me incredibly jealous because that's what I want to do at some point.
Yeah.
But why did you particularly want to write about McKinley?
I think because he is lesser known. I'm attracted to sort of underappreciated political, historical figures. And also, I have a connection of a sort because I visited Buffalo in upstate New York a few years ago. I've explored the US pretty thoroughly. But that's where McKinley was assassinated. And there is a very unusually modest sort of stone obelisk marking this. It's not even an obelisk. It's just a very small marker in what is now a fairly sort of humdrum suburb of Buffalo. And it says, in the Pan American Temple of Music, which covered this spot, President McKinley was fatally shot September the 6th, 1901. And I just found that quite intriguing that, Abraham Lincoln's assassination site is well known. The details of that have been recorded at length. Kennedy's assassination site in Dallas, Texas, of course, is almost a tourist attraction. But no one I knew had been to upstate New York, to Buffalo. And also in Buffalo is the house where McKinley died. It took a while, and where Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as his successor.
It is, we'll come on to the assassination a little bit later, but it is a fascinating thought that timing is everything in terms of when you're assassinated, because obviously Lincoln's presidency was one of those landmarks presidencies, so that's why we all know about the assassination. Kennedy as well, but obviously McKinley less so. Well, let's talk a little bit about his background. He was born in Ohio. What was his childhood and education like?
Well, if we go a bit further back, he's one of many US presidents of what the Americans call Ulster Scots descent. So way back, his family were Scottish. The spelling of his name changed over time. They moved to Ulster, what is now Northern Ireland, and from there, like many at that time, they moved to the United States. He grew up in Niles, Ohio, the seventh of 9 children. His education was pretty unremarkable given his later career. He was a postal clerk, a teacher in Poland, Ohio, and then he worked as a lawyer. But the making of the young William McKinley was really the American Civil War. Rutherford B. Hayes, a future president, became his mentor during the war and after. That was a significant partnership. Hayes wrote in his diary at the time that his new second lieutenant was an exceedingly bright, intelligent and gentlemanly young officer. And McKinley rose through the ranks during that conflict, hugely significant in US history. And it was really the making of him. He wrote a history of what he called the War of the Rebellion. And after the Civil War, he worked as a lawyer. He was at Albany Law School and mainly in Warren, Ohio. And his first political posting, so he switches from law to the politics, is when he's elected prosecuting attorney of Stark County, a surprise victor over the incumbent Democrat.
So did his political career progress fairly quickly? Yeah,
and largely due to the sort of patronage of Rutherford B. Hayes. So McKinley enters Congress for the first time in October 1877. But again, it's a pretty unstable period. The Democrats are constantly redistricting or gerrymandering him out of Congress. So he loses his seat in 1882. He's re-elected 2 years later, and he loses again in 1890. But although he was pretty unflashy, a very kindly man, but he did sort of work in the back rooms of the Republican Party pretty effectively. And Rutherford B. Hayes being president was obviously quite useful for his career. And yeah, by the 1888 Republican National Convention, McKinley is making his mark nationally as well as in Ohio.
So how did he really rise to the top to even be considered as a presidential candidate?
Well, at that convention, there's an attempt to put his name on the ballot for nominee, and McKinley actually declines. And this, as Hayes later tells him, was a better crown than to have been nominated. So it's seen as a sort of tactically a very shrewd move that he doesn't feel ready for the Republican nomination, but having declined so gracefully and apparently this great act of self-sacrifice, this stands him in good stead for much later on. So in the interim, he becomes governor of Ohio. He moves to the capital with his wife Ida Saxton, and they do 2 terms there. So, it's a fairly major state at that point, significant for the Republicans. And there's a sense that he's biding his time, really. He's been told by Hayes, go off and be a governor for a couple of terms, earn your spurs, and your time will come.
So what kind of Republican was he, given that the politics of the time, I guess, still was really experiencing the overhang of the Civil War?
He's a protectionist. So in economic terms, his policy as governor, as an activist in the party, and as president is very much protective tariffs to protect American workers, especially in heavy industry. Stable currency. One of his first acts is securing the passage of the Gold Standard Act, which stripped away sort of decades of fiscal ambiguity and defined the dollar solidly in relation to gold. And in terms of foreign affairs, he has no interest, and this is striking given what transpires in his first and little bit of a second term as president. He states famously that peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency.
So leading up to the presidential election of 1896, how did he position himself? Who were his main allies?
So McKinley's main associate in the run-up to that election is Mark Hanna, and they sort of plan his bid during 1895 and 1896, and during a key meeting at Hanna's home, McKinley comes up with the slogan, "The bosses against the people." It sounds a bit clunky. It's later modified to "the people against the bosses." So he's very much positioning himself as a man of the people. He's not going to be a creature of the bosses, i.e. the Republican Party senior figures, the sort of patriarchs of the state and nationwide, who generally select a candidate who will do what he's told. So McKinley quite cleverly sets himself up as a populist, I guess, a mainstream populist figure. That slogan plays very well, but the campaign, remarkably, although it's written up as one of the first modern campaigns in US politics, McKinley doesn't leave Ohio. He stays put. It's called the front porch strategy. So while his Democrat rival, William Jennings Bryan, is taking trains and all over the US, McKinley stays put. This is largely on account of his wife's health. Devoted to Ida, they have a pretty tragic backstory. They've lost two daughters as children. Ida has a nervous breakdown. Her health is very fragile. So largely on account of that, McKinley stays put. And instead of travelling to the voters, sort of delegations from each state come to his front porch, thus the name, and he gives a series of fairly carefully tailored speeches to them. But the reason it's considered the first modern campaign is that the literature distributed by the McKinley campaign across the country is not generic. It's tailored to individual demographic groups, and that will be recognizable to modern campaigners, but it was the first time it happened in a US election.
It's interesting because I think you are the fourth or fifth of these podcasts that I've recorded on American presidents, and certainly Simon Marks thought that Andrew Jackson's campaign was the first modern day one, and I'm trying to remember there was one slightly after, and I can't remember which one it was now. But given that Andrew Jackson was over 70 years before McKinley, and the other one that I now can't remember was about 60 or 50. It's quite stark that he didn't campaign, even though you say it was a populist campaign. It wasn't, and it was the people against the bosses. He didn't really mix among the people, did he?
Yeah. No, indeed, he stayed put. And, these days that would be an absolute killer, the idea that you're not travelling far and wide. But it seemed to work for him. On the day, he gets 271 electoral college votes to Bryan's 176, and he sweeps the key battleground states of the upper Midwest, which are key for the Republicans then, as more recently. So it works. He's vindicated by that, and some of that modernising instinct carries into his first term. And I guess the crucial context, you mentioned Andrew Jackson, but of course at the turn of last century, it's a key period in sort of mass media. You have this profusion of newspapers. You're beginning, wireless telegraph has transformed communications. And I think what McKinley did was take advantage of what was then that new medium, that ability to get his message far and wide and very quickly. In the White House, he sets aside part of that building for journalists, for reporters. That at the time was an innovation, now obviously a fixture of the scene. And strikingly, in those days, the White House was considered a public building, and sightseers could roam around until 2 p.m. every day. Obviously unthinkable in a modern context. But as I say in my chapter for the book, I think McKinley was of the same view as Queen Elizabeth, that the US commander-in-chief at that point had to be seen to be believed. And so he was very much a glad-hander. He wanted to meet as many voters as possible, even within the confines of that first campaign where he didn't leave Ohio.
So what were the challenges facing the America of 1897?
Well, initially, it's economic. The president says during the campaign that he's basically not interested in foreign wars or expansion. It's going to be very much a domestic agenda. Economically, McKinley has made his name in Congress as an advocate of protective tariffs. So he's really aiming for financial and fiscal stability. He promotes something called the Dingley Tariff as soon as he's elected, which protects manufacturers and factory workers from foreign competition. And in 1900, so a few years into his first term, he secures the passage of the Gold Standard Act, which strips away decades of sort of fiscal ambiguity and defines the dollar in relation to gold. And this coincides with a massive expansion of the American economy. It really booms. And arguably, at this point, the US is emerging as the West's main economic superpower, beginning to overtake the then extensive British Empire.
And in terms of foreign policy, you've already said that wasn't something that foreign affairs he didn't really know much about before he came into office. I think you also say in his inauguration address, he makes clear that he's determined to fight for peace, as the saying goes. But he was kind of thrown off course on that very quickly.
Yeah, basically it's events in Cuba. There's an ongoing Cuban rebellion which, by dint of geography, draws the US into that situation. There's a sporadic campaign for independence in Cuba. It's then part of the Spanish Empire, and opposition to Spanish colonial rule has essentially grown into a civil war, a conflict in Cuba. There's reprisals from Spain. US public opinion sides with the Cuban underdogs, and although McKinley is still very much in favour of a peaceful solution to this situation, when it becomes clear that Spain has no intention of granting Cuba any degree of autonomy within the Spanish Empire, McKinley's key decision is sending the USS Maine to Havana following riots. On the 15th of February 1898, famously, the Maine explodes and sinks with the loss of 266 American lives. There's a great sort of jingoistic campaign whipped up by the popular press, William Randolph Hearst. A naval inquiry concludes that it's an underwater mine. To this day, it's not actually clear if this was Spanish-Cuban sabotage, but nevertheless, in the context, the sort of hothouse of that period, the cry goes up in Congress to declare war. McKinley's still pushing for what he calls neutral intervention to safeguard US interests in Cuba, but Congress is of a different mind. And McKinley begins to shift. He says in a note, his biographers quote, "While we are conducting war and until its conclusion, we must keep all we get. When the war is over, we must keep what we want." So here you have the shift from the peacetime president to the wartime president, and crucially, in terms of global history, the point at which the US starts to acquire an empire, if you like.
Including the Philippines, which I think a lot of people listening to this will not know that America used to be the ruler of the Philippines.
Yeah, and for quite a period, and indeed the US influence in the Philippines lasted up until the Second World War. I went to Manila a few years ago, and it's strikingly American in appearance and character and culture, and that's a product of that colonial period. So Cuba was the first acquisition, if you like, although sort of US governance of that was pretty brief. It was only a couple of years at the beginning of last century. The Philippines becomes the much more enduring focus of American imperialism. You also have Guam and Puerto Rico, and of course to this day they remain US territories. And also closer to home, you have, I guess, the sort of completion of westward expansion in the United States to include the islands of Hawaii, and that occurs during McKinley's first term as president.
And of course, McKinley appointed William Howard Taft as the governor of the Philippines, who was then to become president and then head of the Supreme Court. Any other foreign policy issues that affected his presidency?
Yeah, so China is also kind of central to this period. And that sort of confirms, there's an argument that confirms US sort of global supremacy during that period. prior to McKinley's term, US interests and citizens in what was called the Middle Kingdom had relied on the sort of casual protection of other global powers, including the British. But the Philippines and the US presence in the Philippines meant it now had ships and troops in that part of the world and could send its own forces in defence of its missionaries and its businessmen. And that happened after the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The US was a major player in what was known as the International China Relief Expedition. And this leads to an open door policy in which several nations are trading freely with China in return for a pledge not to violate its territorial integrity. But again, there you have this sort of massive and hugely commercially important expansion of US power.
And what about relations with the UK? Because given the history of America-UK relationships up to that point, this was quite a turning point.
Yeah, now the special relationship, as you'll know, is much mythologized.
I shudder every time I hear the phrase.
And several, including the current Prime Minister, doesn't like that phrase. But it was certainly a pretty strong relationship at the turn of last century. And I find that interesting because, as I said before, the US is beginning to overtake the British Empire as the major economic power, I guess because they're in what historians would now call the Anglosphere. Lord Salisbury, who's the British Prime Minister at that point, seems quite relaxed about this new role. And when Queen Victoria dies at the beginning of 1901, McKinley dispatches this massive wreath for her funeral, which I guess reflects this new sort of bond between the US and its former colonial governors.
Now, he did equivocate about running for a second term, but decided to in the end. The election was in the end of 1900, inauguration in 1901. Was that election almost a foregone conclusion, or did McKinley really have to fight to retain office?
There's no sense he had to fight, really. His re-election campaign runs on protectionism, as he'd campaigned on 4 years earlier, but this time with a huge dollop of imperialism as well. So you have, again, the two elections are similar in some respects, but also quite different. He wins an even bigger victory on this occasion, despite
against the same opponent.
Same opponent. Jennings. He makes only one public speech during the campaign, so he's a bit more active than before. He travels a bit more. He wins 292 electoral votes to Bryan's 155. Republicans make gains in both the House and the Senate, so he very much consolidates his position. And he remarks to his secretary, "I can no longer be called the president of a party. I am now the president of the whole people."
So it all came to an end about, 7 or 8 months later in Buffalo. Just take us through what happened on that fateful day.
So the context is quite interesting. There was an increase at this point in several countries around the world of what we would now call terrorism. You had huge sort of international instability, and there were various emerging forces. So there's something called the Pan American Exposition being held in upstate New York. These were a fixture in the US at this time, indeed in the UK, sort of industrial exhibitions to showcase US economic and military might. McKinley travelled to Buffalo for that. He was keen to meet as many people as possible. As I said before, he was very much a handshaker. So he's at the exposition and basically a Polish-American anarchist whose name I can't hope to pronounce, but the first name is Leon, basically lines up to shake hands with the president. The idea of any security at this point seems quite lax. Although, interestingly, McKinley's cousin had, a couple of years earlier, articulated a genuine fear that McKinley might, be assassinated because he was aware that things were pretty lax. And McKinley was almost absurdly complacent about this threat. He just couldn't conceive of anyone wanting to kill him because he thought he was a man of the people. The voters loved him. So Leon lines up to shake hands at the temple of...
I'm going to make a stab at the pronunciation because I had to for the audiobook recording. I've got no idea if it's right, but I called him Leon Czolgosz.
Czolgosz. That sounds, certainly the first part. We'll go for that. Leon Czolgosz.
With a silent C.
He lines up at the Temple of Music. I'm sure someone will correct us.
I'm sure they will.
McKinley reaches out to shake Leon's left hand. Leon's right hand had been injured. He then pressed a .32 caliber pistol against the president's chest and fires twice. Am I shot? McKinley asks his detective, into whose arms he falls. I fear you are, Mr. President, he replies. And strikingly, and this is, to McKinley's immense credit, he makes a point, even in his condition, of saying to his detectives, don't harm this guy who's just shot him twice at close range. Initially, it seemed it was a fairly superficial wound, and he was expected to recover. But unknown to his doctors, the second bullet had caused gangrene to grow on the walls of his stomach, and this slowly poisoned his blood. And by this point, he's at a house on the other side of the city, which belongs to Ainsley Wilcox, which is another interesting presidential site in Buffalo to this day. So he dies pretty slowly and pretty painfully, and he whispers to his wife, "It is God's way, His will, not ours, is done." And that's it. As you say, just a few months into his second term.
It is one of those moments where you think, well, what if he had lived? What if he had served out his second term? Would Theodore Roosevelt then have automatically become the next president? Probably. That would have been, in 1905, 1906?
Yeah.
Would that have altered the course of history at all? Probably not.
No, and that's the interesting thing, because I think it's largely because Roosevelt had a much larger personality. He came to dominate, and the achievements of McKinley came to be associated with Roosevelt, or they came to be seen as inevitable. The US was inevitably at that stage going to gain an empire. It was inevitably going to become an economic superpower. Roosevelt, unlike McKinley, was an enthusiastic imperialist, and I guess he could articulate that sort of new American era with much more vigour than McKinley. And so basically McKinley's term in a bit gets wrapped into Roosevelt's very high profile, very successful term as president, and McKinley gets forgotten about.
Until the 1950s, you say that's when biographers and historians started to upgrade his reputation a little bit. Is that process still ongoing now, do you think?
It is, yeah. There's been a couple of recent biographies, I think one last year actually, and I forget who did it, but it's a fairly high-profile figure in the Republican Party, and he's quite zealously trying to rejuvenate McKinley's reputation. But Robert W. Murray in 2017, he argued that McKinley paved the way for what is called the American century. And I think there's a pretty good argument there, for all the reasons I've described, the imperial expansion, the economic expansion, that sort of cementing of the US's status as the sort of policeman of the world and a global economic superpower. And of course, that is still very much the US enduring role, although China, which I mentioned earlier, is now competing. But also Guam and Puerto Rico are still there as US territories on either side of the planet, and that's very much testament to McKinley's term as president.
Well, he's certainly someone that I want to read more on, so I might buy one of those biographies. David, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of The Presidents and Prime Ministers, and if you enjoyed it, you can buy either book in hardback as an ebook, or you can download them from Audible. Join us again next week for another episode of The Presidents and Prime Ministers. Goodbye.